Creepypastas! There's so many, and they've been around for so long, it's safe to assume that everyone's at least heard of one. Creepy stories often centered around monstrous characters that are probably most people's first experience with internet horror. Sonic.exe, Jeff the Killer, Ben Drown, all prolific creepypasta characters whose stories are more goofy than spooky. Let's be honest, a lot of the big creepypastas aren't that creepy. A lot try far too hard to be scary and usually just end up becoming very edgy and over the top. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, campy horror still has its place in the genre. And overly edgy characters can be a lot of fun, or even really cool. But I find a lot of creepypasta characters and their stories are viewed less as figures of terror and more like quirky scamps. Although, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a creepypasta that genuinely sent a shiver down my spine. In fact, there's one such story that, to this day, I consider one of the best short horror stories ever made. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Candle Cove. Now, for those of you who don't know, Candle Cove is a pretty famous creepypasta presented as an online forum discussing an old kids show. It's a pretty short read, so I encourage anyone who hasn't already heard of it to go and read it now, since I'll be spoiling what it is and what made it so scary. On a net nostalgia forum discussing local TV shows, a user named SkyShale33 asks if anyone remembered a show they watched as a kid in 1971 called Candle Cove. Multiple users confirm the show's existence and share their memories of the puppet show and its memorable characters, such as a marionette made of multiple parts named Pirate Percy, a little girl named Janice, and a large foam boat puppet with a moving jaw named the Laughingstock. The mention of the ship reminds Mike Painter 65 of a show quote, "You have to go inside," a catchphrase apparently used throughout the show to get a cowardly Pirate Percy to face their fears. The forum then discusses the villains of the show, remembering a mustache head with long teeth and a monocle, named Horace Horrible. But Horace wasn't the villain and was just a minion to the show's real antagonist, the Skin Taker. A dirty skeleton puppet who had glass eyes too big for his skull, a top hat and cloak sewn out of human skin, and a wire jaw that slid back and forth. Mike Painter then recounts a scene where Janice asks the Skin Taker why its mouth moved like that, to which the Skin Taker replied to grind your skin. Skyshale is relieved other people remember the show, admitting that it gave them nightmares as a kid. They had this dream where, after the opening credits rolled, the show cut to the characters screaming, their puppet bodies flailing around as Janice cried. Other users then jump in and say that it wasn't a dream and that they've seen the exact episode Skyshale described. Skyshale states it's not possible and that it couldn't have been an episode because there wasn't a plot. But another user backs up the claim, stating that they've seen the episode too, the forum settling into an uneasy discomfort. The last post is from Mike Painter, stating that he went to visit his mom in the nursing home and asked her about Candle Cove. His mother was surprised that Mike remembered it. When Mike pressed further, his mother informed him that he'd tell her he was going to watch Candle Cove before tuning into dead air and watching static. Now, I think a key part of Candle Cove is the way in which it is presented. It's not written like a conventional story, it's written out to be an internet forum, which lends itself some credibility and helps bolster the reader's suspension of disbelief. Since it's not told by some nebulous narrator, it's more diegetic, presented in a medium that gives it an in-universe presence, which I believe makes the clearly fiction story a bit more believable. Let us also address the character of the Skin Taker. After all, I went on a little tirade at the beginning of this video talking about how I find most creepypasta characters overly edgy. Surely the Skin Taker checks that box too. Well, I give the Skin Taker a pass mainly because he doesn't exist. And I don't just mean that they're not real in the sense that they're a creepypasta character. I mean that in the context of their own universe, they're a work of fiction. They're quite literally the villain of a kid's show. And sure, at first, Skin Taker sounds too on the nose for a character in a creepypasta. Like, no way would a children's show villain be so overtly scary as to say things like, "to grind your skin." But then you realize that plenty of children's content goes a little far when compared to modern stories. The Coachman, Large Marge, This Walrus. Heck, one of the oldest kid stories, Jack and the Beanstalk, has a giant saying, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." which is pretty much what the Skin Taker is saying, just replace the words bone with skin and bread with clothes. But do you want to know what I think really makes Candle Cove so good? They don't highlight a threat and they don't show their hand. It's pretty funny when you think about it. I consider Candle Cove one of the spookiest short stories I've ever read, and at no point in the story are any of the characters in harm's way. It's just people discussing a really freaky kid show from their childhood, and then learning that it might not have existed. Most other creepypastas would have made it to where the show stole kids or caused people to die, but Candle Cove instead opts for an uneasy cliffhanger that I honestly think is scarier than anything murderous, because it leaves the reader with a lot of questions. What the heck is Candle Cove? Why does it exist? It doesn't kill or hurt people, so what does it do? Is it just meant to be scary, or is there something deeper? That's another thing I admire about this story. It ends really abruptly and explains nothing. We humans are terrified of that which we do not understand or know, and while I adore lore, explaining horror can sometimes make it less effective. And Candle Cove is effective. I mean, it must be, right? Since it's stuck with me for so many years. Not to mention, it was apparently good enough to get its own TV show, although I have my doubts about it. I mean, I haven't seen the show, but one of the key points that made Candle Cove so scary was its medium as an internet forum. Something the show can't do unless they pull an Unfriended. I also worry that the show will make Candle Cove somehow a physical threat to give the show some action, or that it will answer many of the questions left behind by Candle Cove, which again, I believe will lessen the horror. But this video isn't about the TV adaptation of Candle Cove. It's about what made Candle Cove so creepy. Its in-universe medium, its abrupt ending, and its unresolved questions. Which got me thinking. I mean, surely Candle Cove can't be the only creepypasta that checks these 3 boxes. And so I did some digging and voila, I have 2 more creepypastas that have the same key points. And if the 3 factors I listed are what truly made Candle Cove scary, then these 2 stories should also live up to my expectations, right? Well, let's put it to the test. First we have Ted the Caver, a creepypasta which is often considered to be the first ever made. I read this a long time ago and immediately thought of it when I started writing this video essay on Candle Cove. Now, I'm about to summarize it, simplifying a lot of the story for time's sake, so if you want to experience this masterpiece for yourself, I recommend reading it before I continue. I remember this being a really good read. Let's see if it still holds up. The story begins with Ted stating that he's sharing his caving journal due to public demand. The journal in question describes him and his friend's experience with a strange phenomena in the cave only referred to as Mystery Cave, since Ted doesn't want to reveal the cave's location. In the first entry, Ted and his friend B decide to go caving in Mystery Cave before the new year, excited to explore a small passage with lots of air blowing out of it, citing a saying amongst cavers that if a passage has good airflow, it's worth investigating. They climbed down to check out the small opening in the cave, finding a 3 to 5 inch thick wall that leads into a tight passage and eventually opens up into a crawl space and then more. To access the passage, they need to widen the hole, and plan to bring tools to break up the rock. They decide to name the passage Floyd's Tomb, as a tribute to Floyd Collins, a caver who got stuck in a tight crawl space in the early 19th century. The second entry details Ted and B's slow start and mainly details the tools they're working with, commenting on the difficulty of getting tools into the cave, the frustration of certain tools being unavailable, like the sledgehammer, and the limitation of the tool's battery. They leave for a motel to recharge their stuff, noting the persistence of rumbling and howling from beyond the hole, dismissing it as noise from a highway above ground. Ted makes a little interlude between entries to explain a bit more about caving and the cave in question. The cave was discovered decades ago and has been visited by locals and avid cavers. The condition of the cave has deteriorated due to dust, graffiti, vandals, and regular use. To enter the cave, a good length of rope is needed to rappel down, and due to the immense darkness, artificial light is necessary inside the cave, usually in the form of a battery-operated, helmet-mounted light. He also elaborates on the system in place between himself and B, where they take turns working and resting, Ted eager to get into the passage. In the third entry, the boys are excited to get back to work, driven by the thought of being the first people to explore the unclaimed cave. This time, they bring Bee's pet dog, Whip, and while she's used to caves, the dog is oddly frightened and refuses to go near the hole. Ted and Bee decide that while one person works, the other will stay with Whip. While Bee is working on the hole, the air mysteriously stops, accompanied by a grinding sound. They find this bizarre, but casually dismiss it at the thought of the progress they've made. The fourth entry picks up after a 3-week break, approaching the project more seriously this time, reflecting on the unexplained events from their previous trip. They notice the breeze and the rumbling again as they start working, the thickness of the passage increasing as they enlarge the hole, slowing their progress. Work continues as normal until they hear a scream from the other side of the hole. Bee panics and suggests blocking the hole in case it's an animal. Ted doesn't think it's an animal. The boys work a bit more and then head back to the hotel, still freaked out by the noise. In the next entry, the boys finally get the hole wide enough to fit in. They detail the physical discomfort and struggle of squeezing through the passage, expressing the claustrophobic feeling of being pinned in a small space. Despite being unable to progress further, Ted feels a sense of accomplishment and pushes themselves beyond their perceived limits. The passage marks a major milestone in Ted's caving experience, and they reflect on the physical and mental challenges they've encountered. The boys have quickly forgotten about the noise from the previous entry. After a several-week break, Ted and Bee return to the cave, noting in this new entry their preparation and practice in a squeeze box, and the fashioning of tools better equipped to carve out the last bit of the hole. A bit of work later, and Ted is finally able to squeeze past Floyd's tomb, making it to the other side, finding and taking pictures of rock formations, crystals, and hieroglyphs, though the photos of the hieroglyph and the room it's in didn't develop and turned out clear. The next entry details Bee inviting an expert caver referred to as Joe to come along. They help Joe in and explain how far they can go, but send him by himself due to Ted sustaining a head injury. Joe is gone for far too long, and both Bee and Ted begin to worry. Thankfully, Joe comes back and the three leave, but Joe refuses to answer questions with anything but a simple no. And when Bee and Ted ask if Joe would like to visit the cave again, Joe tells them he's never going back. In the second to last entry, Ted and Bee go back to the cave with a short-range wire phone, so Bee can talk to Ted on the other side. Ted enters Floyd's tomb and starts exploring, but stops at the sound of grinding stone, standing up too quickly and breaking his light, forcing him to use glow sticks to illuminate his way back. As he cautiously retreads his footsteps back to the passage, he's shocked to see the phone line has been stuck under a rock. Getting closer, he recoils in fear, realizing that behind the rock is a 45-degree chute he hadn't noticed before. He hurries to the squeeze and forces himself through as fast as he can, with no regard for his own pain. A horrible stench bellows from behind him as the wind from the cave returns. Ted and Bee scramble back up their rope and out of the cave, Ted spotting that something is pulling at the other end of the rope further into the cave. Once outside, the boys cut the rope, sending it flying down into the cave as they book it out of there. The last entry is written 3 weeks later. Ted shares some updates about his condition, his plans for the cave, and the events of the past few weeks. His mental state has worsened since the cave, with feelings of anxiety, foreboding, and tension, experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as terrifying nightmares. Recently, he's run into Joe and Bee, both of whom have shared similar terrible experiences, leading them to plan a return to the cave. The three of them aim to enter the cave with better preparation, including a gun, knife, first aid kit, food, water, camera, and sources of light. Ted informs his concerned friends, family, and readers that he'll update the site with any answers he finds once he gets back. And then the journal ends. Now right away, Ted the Caver checks off the biggest box that made Candle Cove spooky. It's in-universe medium. Though instead of an internet forum, it's a caving journal. I actually like this a bit more than the forum, just because reading through someone else's journal gives us a clear look at their thoughts without feeling omnipotent. Reading about Ted's caving experiences through his perspective makes the story feel a lot more personal and grounded, lending itself that odd sense of credibility that Candle Cove had. And on the subject of the journal and its entries, let's touch upon that ending. It is the perfect cliffhanger. Throughout the journal, Ted has been documenting his experiences with the cave, writing entries whenever he gets back. That last entry radiated with Ted's fear, his determination, steeling himself to take a gun and go back into the cave, informing his readers that he'll make an update when he gets back. And that's where it ends. No more updates. The implications are beautiful. We have no idea what happened when Ted entered the cave, but it's clear that he never got back to write an update, leaving the story to the reader's imagination. Personally, my headcanon is that he went into the cave, had a few spooks with whatever was causing the noise, and then decided to go down that weird chute, wherever it may lead. A lot of Ted the Caver's horror comes from the claustrophobic terror that is caves, hence why they call back to Floyd Collins. No one wants to be trapped miles underground surrounded by cramped darkness. But anyone could write a scary story about getting stuck in a cave. No, what makes this story scary is the questions it leaves hanging. The odd noises, the tunnel that leads down at a steep angle, the hieroglyph. None of these things are explained, and that is terrifying. We humans are curious by nature. We like to understand things, so when an author leaves us something unexplained or ill-defined, our imagination kicks in and fills in the blanks for us, often coming up with something far scarier than anything the author could have put into words. And while leaving gaps and blanks in information usually leaves the audience feeling underwhelmed, I think this level of ambiguity is only a detriment to longer stories, where the readers want to know things and build upon that knowledge as the story progresses. I think horror stories like Candle Cove and Ted the Caver are short enough that the lack of information doesn't frustrate their readers, but rather excites them, with infinite possibilities and room for speculation. Like, what's the thing in the cave? It could have been a monster like in The Descent, or maybe it was a vengeful spirit, or maybe something unfathomable. The story never outright tells you, and I think that is beautiful. I have the utmost respect for horror stories that exhibit this level of narrative restraint. It would be so easy to describe a gross or imposing monster, and yet this story never does that. Much like Candle Cove, Ted the Caver also has a screen adaptation, and once more I have my doubts. Again, these stories have a lot of restraint, and their strength comes from their unanswered cliffhangers. I worry that a movie medium would try to tie up loose ends, wouldn't be as immersive, and have a less interesting / more omnipotent perspective. But then again, I haven't seen the film, so I can't complain. Now, I have to admit, when I first thought of talking about this 2 months ago, I was having trouble finding a third creepypasta that fit my criteria. Candle Cove was the origin of this topic, and I quickly remembered Ted the Caver since both stories have memorable cliffhangers. And I read the two around the same time, way back in middle school. I started typing out this essay back in March, but realized that merely covering 2 stories that shared similar elements wouldn't effectively prove that those elements are what made those stories spooky. No, I'd need to find another creepypasta to round off the trio. One that followed and tested the criteria I set. And then I procrastinated for 2 months, leaving this video's script at Ted's journal, and reading a creepypasta every Sunday on the off chance that I'd find something. Oh, and find something I did, because not only did I find a creepypasta that proves my points, I found one far more spooky than Candle Cove, one that may now be my favorite creepypasta ever, The Dionaea House. It begins with a statement from a man named Eric, explaining that he made this site to share the emails between himself and his friend Mark, hoping that it'll help shine some light on why he did what he did. The first email is Mark reaching out to Eric, saying that he got a newspaper clipping in the mail apparently about a mutual friend named Drew. Mark then asks Eric if he's heard about what happened already. Eric remembers Drew, and Mark goes on to recall more about Drew being an annoying but well-meaning guy, stating that he's been trying to track down their friends Travis and Dave, thinking that they might know more about what happened to Andrew, since Travis was the one to give Drew rides. Mark gets sidetracked for a bit mentioning Drew's realtor stepdad and the house they owned out past Highway 6, before sharing the news article. Drew had shot and killed a couple, John and Lucy Madsen, and then turned the gun on himself. Eric is stunned and can't believe that the Drew they knew could do something like that, going as far as to suggest the newspaper clipping might be a sick prank. But Mark called the hospital and they have Drew's body on file. The story is true. Mark then tells Eric that he suspects Drew's mother might have been the one to send him the clipping, and that he'll keep Eric updated on whatever he finds. Mark messages Eric late at night telling Eric that something has been eating at him and that he's finally realized what it is, asking Eric if he remembers the last game night they ever had with Drew. Drew had been forced to house sit for one of his father's property and asked if any of the guys could stay with him while he did so, since the house scared him, but no one offered to go. When the 10 days were up and Drew was done house-sitting, they got together for a game night, but Drew was acting strangely, recounting commercials word by word, parroting stuff the other people said, and responding to complaints with a simple okay. Mark thinks something about Drew changed in those 10 days, and partially blames himself for not saying anything. A reporter from the Idaho Statesman gives Mark a call. He reached out to them, having tracked down the source of the article clipping. Mark asked them if they had any other details about the crime, stuff that didn't find its way into the article. And she told Mark that according to witnesses, Drew kept repeating, "The door is open." Mark doesn't understand what this means and urges Eric to write back. In the next email, Mark tells Eric that he's going to fly down to Houston to see if he can find someone in Andrew's family. Mark's girlfriend Jennifer is worried about him, but Mark says he has to keep going, stating that something about that house Drew watched changed him, hollowed him out, and Mark needs to know what. Eric calls Mark and they briefly talk about Travis and how he said that Drew was pacing strangely the last time they picked him up. Mark confides to Eric that he can't talk about any of this with his girlfriend, and that he's glad he has Eric to talk to. Mark arrives in Houston and sends Eric a short email joking about how grueling it's going to be trying to track down Drew's mother's apartment. The next day, Mark sets about finding the apartment and gets lucky. He then lies about being a private investigator to get more information and secures the name of Drew's realtor stepdad, Kurt Malone. He then uses the name to get in touch with some of Kurt's employers, and after wading through awkward HR talk, gets the address of the house Drew watched. Mark gets in touch with Eric after trying to call him multiple times, relaying what he's found. The house is a generic one-story brick thing, the roof is scarred in places, the driveway has cracks in the pavement, and a plank is missing from the gate. No one is home, so Mark talks with the neighbor who informs him about the people who used to live there before Kurt. A couple who sold their house and bought an RV home. Their names were John and Lucy Madsen. Mark flies out to Boise, Idaho. His girlfriend is mad at him and his watch has stopped working. On top of that, he's got a ringing in his right ear. Eric asks Mark if he wants him to share any of this with anyone, maybe get the police involved. But Mark believes it'll only draw in skeptics and nutjobs, and that if word got around to his job or family, they'd probably think he's crazy. Instead, Mark tells Eric that he can hold on to these emails as evidence in case he gets into any trouble. Calling the hospital again, Mark is able to dig up some information on the relatives of the Madisons, and plans to visit the relatives that ID'd their bodies. Visiting the Madisons' cousin, Greg Archer, sheds some light on the Madisons before they were shot and killed. Apparently, after they moved into the house down in Houston, things started to go wrong, and eventually the couple bought an RV and lived constantly on the road. But their RV broke down in Idaho, which is why they stayed with their cousin Greg. The weird thing is that the couple barricaded a closed door in the guest room they were sleeping in, kept the lights on always, and bundled up in woolen sheets. The next email is just Mark telling Eric about a fly trap he saw on the Discovery Channel, comparing it to his current predicament, stating that he feels like this is somehow all a trap, bait luring him into something he can't get out of. Mark talks to the police and is pointed to a detective. He tells the detective about the Madison connection, and the police say they'll look into it. Mark is then asked if he'd like to sign for Drew's personal effects. It turns out that Drew had a lot of license for multiple states, which leads him to the address of the house Drew stayed in while in Idaho. The next few entries are texts from Mark to Eric. He gets to the house and it's the same as the one in Houston, right down to the roof and the broken fence. Mark talks to the neighbor who tells Mark that the house has been rented out as far back as he can remember. He goes on and rings the doorbell, but there's no answer. Mark is confused and doesn't know what to do. His ears are ringing. Then he spots a way inside. He tries to call Eric before going inside. The air is cold and smells of metal. It seems nobody is home. He then finds a flight of stairs, which is odd considering he doesn't recall seeing a second story from outside. The phone signal is really bad, but Mark presses on, commenting that the layout is bizarre. There's a metal door at the end of the hall. Mark decides to check other rooms out first, still trying his best to reach Eric. In one of the rooms, he finds Drew's backpack and decides to leave, but is stopped when he hears a sound. The door is open. The next email is from Jennifer using Mark's PC. She is searching through it on the request of Eric. Mark has gone missing. She tells Eric that she knows Eric knows more than he's letting on, and begs him to tell her what happened, to show her the other emails. Eric receives an email from an unknown person. It appears to be a clip of a news article talking about human bones that just appeared in the street. But Eric isn't entertaining the thought, ending the story by saying, "Whoever you are, whatever you are, fuck you. I may not know you, but I can tell what this is, and I'm not fooled. Your Venus flytrap game won't work. I'll make damn sure to warn Jenny and the others too, so nice try, but no one is falling for your bait this time. It stops here." Right off the bat, I have to say I love the form of an email archive. It's my favorite in-universe medium out of the three, because it has that personal feel that journals have while also giving us vital information due to being the way the characters communicate with each other in the story. This creepypasta really made me realize that there are a lot of mediums one can write a story in. Heck, the Dionaea House has an updates page that includes a few more short stories that add to the original, both with their own unique in-universe medium, including old messages from the late Lucy and a personal blog from a babysitter. This story has a lot of good parts, from the real feel of the friendship between its protagonists, the rabbit hole investigation journey of the protagonist Mark, and the haunting description of the weird clues. But I think my favorite moment in this is the last thing ever sent by Mark. The door is open. It's a payoff that is set up perfectly and still sends shivers down my spine. We're given the saying really early in the story with no context as to what it could mean, and thus gradually forget about it. But it was given to us in its own email, and it was weird enough so that it would hang in the back of our mind until Mark repeats the phrase at the end. Honestly, this story has a weird standing. It checks the boxes that made Candle Cove so good, but it skirts the line a bit. It explains a bit more than the other two stories, and it's pretty clear that the threat is the house, showcasing that it works like a flytrap, but even spelling out the subtext by having Mark make the comparison for us. But it also leaves enough unexplained that I think it still works. As I've said, these types of short horror stories are built upon hanging questions. I also like Mark's descent into his pseudo-madness, his fervorous knowledge-seeking, reminding me of an old noir detective. And I love that Eric sorta takes Mark's role and mission after Mark goes missing. That line at the end had me smiling ear to ear the first time I read it, no matter how cheesy it may seem. And while I could go on praising these stories' little details for hours, I think I'm gonna stop here. After all, I've answered my own curious question on what made Candle Cove so spooky, mostly the in-universe medium, and have proven that stories with the same 3 points tend to also be scary. But before I end this video, I'd like to say that I've reached an epiphany while writing this essay, because I realized that aside from the 3 points I covered, there's another factor that all 3 of these creepypastas share that made them so appealing to me, and that's the restraint they have. I've mentioned it more than once over the course of this video, but I'm only now realizing that this extends to a lot of horror I enjoy. I have a lot of video topics planned out, and I realize that most, if not all of them, have some praise for the narrative's restraint. It's definitely something I'll have to look out for moving forward. And that's it. As I've said, I've got plenty of video topic ideas to cover and plan to make more video essays as well as several projects I'm still working on, such as Heedley and a few others. See you around.